For years now, Australia's had a problem with wages. They're too low and they're growing too slow. Up just 2% per year since 2013, that's half the traditional rate. Low wages have many consequences. It adds to the financial stress felt by millions of households. It undermines consumer spending and thus slows growth. And it shifts national income even further towards corporations and away from workers. In fact, during the pandemic, the share of the economic pie going to corporations reached its highest point ever, and the share going to workers fell to the lowest ever. That's all because of low wages. This problem has been here for years, long before COVID came along. But now there's a whole new dimension to the wages crisis. Prices are taking off like never before in the last quarter century. And that means wages are falling far behind the prices of what we buy. Before the pandemic, inflation was low, around 2% per year. That offset some of the damage of low wages. Not all, but some. Now, in the last 12 months, inflation has really taken off, up 3.5% in the last year, and it's going to get worse in the coming months because of the war in the Ukraine and what that has done to energy costs. That gap between slow wages and rising inflation means the real purchasing power of your income is shrinking. It's like the money in your wallet is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. In just 18 months since reopening after the first lockdowns, the real purchasing power of Australian wages has fallen by almost 3%. And even the government admits the real wage decline will continue. And it's even worse than that, because prices for the essential products that workers buy have risen even faster. Like fresh meats and produce, like housing, and of course, petrol prices. Everybody sees higher petrol prices, but across the board, prices of goods and services are growing rapidly. And it'll get worse later this year because of the war in Ukraine and the impact on global energy markets. So the loss of purchasing power is a big problem. We're seeing the worst drop in real wages in Australia in at least 30 years. So that leads to an obvious question. What do we do about it? Right-wing politicians are dusting off their old recipe books and preparing to hit us with some terrible policies to wrestle inflation to the ground, like big cuts in government spending, higher interest rates, and more wage suppression to make it even harder for workers to get a pay rise. They did all that in the past, and yes, it brought inflation down, but on the backs of workers, through lost jobs, lost wages, and even more hardship. We need government to protect workers against inflation instead of making us the scapegoats for inflation. Government can directly alter some prices to keep costs down, like reducing or removing user fees for childcare, healthcare, education, public transit, building affordable non-market housing, and accelerating the transition to renewable energy, which is cheaper and not at all affected by outbreaks of global conflict. Most of all, we need government to support higher wages rather than suppressing wages like they do now. That way, workers can be confident their incomes will keep up with rising prices. We need higher minimum wages and award rates, stronger collective bargaining, removing caps on public sector pay, and limiting insecure work like casual jobs and gigs, where workers have no chance of higher pay. This combination of flat pay and rising prices will be a disaster for workers, but it doesn't have to be that way. We have a choice as a society to lift workers' incomes and reduce the cost of the necessities they need, or else to use inflation as yet another excuse to cut our living standards. Let's make sure workers don't pay for this latest surge in consumer prices.